Hello, everyone. This is the 220th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back sports public relations and media operations consultant Mr. Stephen Torres as we discuss the history of American clubs in the Concacaf Champions Cup from 1963 to 1996. Mr. Torres has over 2 decades of national and international experience in the field of sports communications and media relations after having worked with several football soccer organizations. Mr. Torres is also a founding member and the first elected president of the Association of North, Central America, and Caribbean Football Investigators. Welcome back, Stephen.
Thank you, Sean. It's great to be here once again.
Can you discuss and present your project about the Champions Cup participation of American clubs in the CONCACAF regions from 1963 to 1996, as well as describe the research process and the duration it took to complete such a task?
Sure. Once again, it's great for you to have me once again on your podcast. It's truly an honor, and I look forward to presenting what I can from this great project that I just finished, at least the first phase of it, but we'll get into it. As you mentioned, this is the actual, I don't know if you could see it from here, but that I'll send, but you do have, I did send you a copy of it. This is like a hard copy that was made. So going back to how this thing started, well, it pretty much began with another research project that I had under the ANSIF banner. As you mentioned, I am the president of ANSIF, which is, the abbreviation of the Association of North, Central American, and Caribbean Football Investigators. And we have, historians and statisticians from throughout covering this part of the region of the Americas. And one of the projects that I was working on was back in 2022, which was to commemorate the 60-year anniversary of the CONCACAF Champions Cup, because the first one was held in 1962. So that's how the whole thing started, in the sense that I was able to do some research and have a collective detailed information on each of the respective years from that tournament. And of course, highlighting the champion from each and every one of those years. But at the time in 2022, the Champions Cup had not returned, but we'll get to that in a second. But it ran from 1962 with that specific name until 2008. And going back to ANSIF, one of the projects that we normally do, or the work task that we have as an association that we consider ourselves, is that we have 4 investigation committees. And of course, one of them being the men's football and youth, also women's football and youth. The third one is futsal and beach soccer, and the fourth one is club tournament. Now, I'm the president of the investigation committee, also of beach soccer and futsal, but also the club tournament one. So that's how this first project was to commemorate the 60-year anniversary of the CONCACAF Champions Cup history came about. And the thing was that it was in 2022 that I was asked by SASH, who is the Society of American Soccer Historians, to provide some sort of a presentation in one of their respective Zoom sessions. So I kind of turned the 60-year anniversary Champions Cup to more of a U.S. angle. And that's where I began or commenced the research of the U.S. clubs that competed in the CONCACAF tournament. But their angle was from 1963 to 1996, prior to the MLS teams taking part in the event, because I wanted to break it down into 2 separate eras. And that's how this project came about.
And how difficult was it to obtain information that I imagine would not have been readily available?
Ooh. Well, yes, it was very difficult. And we were talking about years from 1963 to 96. This is before MLS teams took part regularly at the tournament, but we're talking about before game streaming availability, overall internet hitting its boom during the success in that time of 1990s. So that's when it was things started to change to what it is now today. But is now you can have so many soccer websites, blogs. It's just back then it was very rare to have any of those types of information. So the key sources were to get this information, Sean, was it was very limited. It was either getting it the old-fashioned way, which was newspaper clippings, sometimes with or without photos. They just had text, a summary. Sometimes it wasn't enough details. Some of them did have details. Some of them, if you were fortunate to have the goal scorers, but if you were lucky enough to also be able to cross path with a former player from those respective teams at the time. I was fortunate to have that opportunity on several occasions, and it was really interesting to try to the amount of details and content and photos, especially from former players from that time was amazing. And I was surprised at how much details on the game reports and photos came from other countries, mostly in ANSIF members from around the region. Now, when I say that is that because, example, you can have a U.S. club team competing down in El Salvador or in Mexico or in Honduras, etc. They did have a pretty detailed coverage of those games and that tournament. So I was really surprised at how much match report details, sometimes action photos, sometimes team photos, because their clubs, champions from that era, were competing against the U.S. club teams, and it was more detailed and more informative.
What is the background to the history and creation of the CONCACAF Champions Cup? And how does it contrast to older and more prestigious European equivalent, as well as the South American Libertadores Cup?
Well, first off, you have to go back. This was pretty much a little bit of a history lesson. Some people may have these details, but it's always great to look back on it. First of all, CONCACAF was formed in around September of 1961. Now, prior to that formation of CONCACAF, there were two regional club tournaments, one in 1959 and one in 1961. Now, the first official CONCACAF Champions Cup took place in 1962. It is the third oldest Confederation Club competition, of course, if you compare it to the UEFA Champions League and their tournaments, as well as CONMEBOL's Copa Libertadores, who are older. And the comparison is that, the CONCACAF wanted to have a similar championship for its clubs that were either the national league champion or the country's respective cup champion competing against each other. And since 1962, it's been a regular for it. Now, there were times where it kind of changed its name or its format. Just going to get a little bit, but from going back, that's why it's called now, once again, the Champions Cup. But beforehand, I said that it ran until 2008 with that official name. Then it was changed to the CONCACAF Champions League, which ran until recently before it once again changed back to being known as the CONCACAF Champions Cup.
So, what can you say about American clubs' participation in this first decade of the 1960s, at a time when soccer would not have been a mainstream sport? And what would have been the reception of it? And specifically, which American league would the American representatives been from? And basically, what entity would have had jurisdiction over it in America?
Well, when you're talking about in the early parts of the 1960s, you have to go back how the U.S. Soccer Federation and what was their identity as an organization is totally different to what they are now known as currently. But back then, the Federation, of course, like any other association under the banner of CONCACAF or FIFA in general, is that you want your national teams to compete internationally. And of course, at the time, they needed to send their respective club champions during that era. I know that the national team was struggling during the 1960s with internationally missing qualification to Chile 62 and England 66. However, going into that sense, there were many, many pro amateur, semi professional leagues regionally throughout the country. And at the time, the U.S. Soccer Federation was based on the East Coast, I believe around in the New York area. During that time, there was a pro amateur league called the German American Soccer League, which is now known to this day as the Cosmopolitan Soccer League, was already established in the New York, New Jersey metro area since 1923. Now, teams from the German American Soccer League had many ethnic names, which were represented by its players from many nationalities. I mean, you're looking at a melting pot of so many players from different parts of the world. But in more details on that history, I would probably recommend speaking to a great person that helped me a lot to finish this project is Bill Martz, who is currently the general secretary of the Cosmopolitan Soccer League. So he can probably give you more details on the history of how it became about the German American Soccer League to becoming the Cosmopolitan Soccer League. Now, the reason why I mentioned that is because many of the U.S. teams that competed in the Champions Cup came from that league to what is known as the Cosmopolitan Soccer League. But the reason why that occurred is because they competed in the what was called back then the U.S. National Challenge Cup, which is now known as the Lamar Hunt U.S. Open Cup. So having won, or several of them having won the championship there, was recognized as the U.S. champion at the time, won the qualification berth to the respective Concacaf Champions Cup. Now, I believe that in 1962, the USSF could not send a representative at the moment to that inaugural tournament. So it wasn't until the following year in 1963 when the 62 Open Cup champions, who were the New York Hungaria Soccer Club, and they had won the Open Cup, earned a qualification to represent the United States in the 1963 CONCACAF Champions Cup. During that time, I mean, I don't want to go into too much details on each and every one of those teams that competed during those years. Just wanted to highlight some of their successes, some of the stories, because most of the details each year is highlighted in the presentation that I did. So, I'll start quickly with the New York Hungaria. I mean, in 1963, they were led by their top scorer, who was Andy Matei. He was a very prolific goal scorer at the time. He did have a U.S. cap during his career. He can probably be a podcast for another time. Sadly, he did pass away in early 2011, but I did have the fortune to interview him. And the reason why I did that during my time at CONCACAF is because of the research that we were trying to find out which was the first U.S. team to compete in that tournament. But also at the same time, I noticed that they were the first team to win in Mexico against then the defending champions at the time, which was Club Deportivo Oro, before a crowd of 35,000 at Guadalajara's Estadio Jalisco. And it was led by Andy Matei with a hat trick. He had all three goals, and that New York team won 3-2. So they went on to win the series, okay, and then they did advance to the next round, but unfortunately they were eliminated by the defending CONCACAF champions at the time, was Guadalajara. So we're looking at, 1963, the first time a U.S. club team goes down to Mexico and beats a Mexican side in you could say at the time, a major competition. So it was a huge highlight back then, but few people know of that history. This was enabled the incentive to try to find out what other information can you find. And then you go to 1964, another club team, not from the Cosmopolitan Soccer League, but an amateur team it's still in existence today, which is the Philadelphia Ukrainian Nationals. Okay. Several Open Cup champions during its respective era, but they were the second team to compete in the Champions Cup, even though they were also a member of the American Soccer League, which was the second version of the American Soccer League prior to the formation of the North American Soccer League, but it was still a league that was functioning within the U.S. landscape. It's interesting because when you go in and you look at what these teams have done, you go back to that 1964, yes, they qualified, but you look at that all the history that you've looked back and you're trying to track down, okay, who were they were supposed to face? Who were they were supposed to face off? And they were scheduled to make their first appearance, but they didn't play an opening round game because their opponent, Club America in 1964, withdrew because of their schedule conflicts. So what do? That Philadelphia club team advances to the second round without even stepping onto the field. Then the next match they're supposed to play against another Mexican side, which was Chivas of Guadalajara. But Chivas of Guadalajara was under a 3-year suspension because of CONCACAF and by the Mexican Federation and CONCACAF because they had not played the final of the 1963 Champions Cup final, which was awarded to a Haitian team, and therefore they were suspended, could not compete. So once again, Philly not having stepping onto the field advances to a third round. Sadly, the schedules were a little bit chaotic. They didn't have concrete international fixture dates. So it was just who's available, when can you play? It was between the two clubs. Sadly, scheduling conflicts played a factor, and Philadelphia had to withdraw from the third round when they were scheduled to play a Cuban side. So it's ironic they go down into history as the second team to qualify for the Champions Cup. However, they didn't even play a match because of several scheduling conflicts that they had. And you saw that very frequently once you're looking at the deck, teams missing qualifications for the 65 tournament, 66 tournament was canceled by CONCACAF because for
Right. When I
whatever
was
reason.
looking at your research, I was surprised that there were years that no team was sent, or like the team that was supposed to go didn't go, so the runner-up went, or so there was a lot of these. Maybe it shows that perhaps the tournament was not taken seriously by most of the sides. Was that your impression?
Yeah, I mean, without having to go into in depth on each and every one of them, yeah, and without highlighting or whether say embarrassing the fans of the club team if they follow them or if they're still in existence. Yes, there were factors that played. Some of the teams may not have taken it seriously. They may have wanted to put more emphasis to their league matches. Sometimes finance was always an issue because remember you're talking about a tournament that's just beginning to blossom in the 1960s.
Also,
You
traveling
must have
would have
had,
been an issue, perhaps, traveling at the time in the 60s,
yeah,
maybe.
I mean you're talking about times where, like I said earlier, you didn't have a concrete fixture calendar dates. So it was pretty much so and so you were drawn to play this team. Okay. So you have to communicate with the other club and state, okay, when are you available to play? Can you play a certain date? Can you play a now the league schedules in the US are totally different compared to the ones in most of Central America and even in the Caribbean. So, and then weather always plays a factor. So how do you schedule the match? Can you go? And then sometimes many of these clubs who were semi-professional or amateur could not have the funding to either stage the games or host the games, as they say, or make the trip down there to have the opportunity to play because sometimes there was always a factor that they had to play a certain date, but then they couldn't meet the expectation. And then when you go into the 1970s, I mean, you had teams that many of these club teams, again, amateur or semi-professional, but even the amateur teams, many of the players there, they also had jobs. They all had their own work professions. So what do you do in that situation? You had to basically take time off of work. And there was a situation where you had a club team that could not fit the schedule because the players could not take time off to work. It played up some factors in some sort of way.
So, and as you go into the 70s, it seems that the US Soccer Federation is still sending teams out who are the winners of the Open Cup. Do you know why the North American Soccer League clubs were not sent at this stage, as they probably would have been at a better quality, except maybe 1971? Was it still a jurisdictional situation?
I mean, the North American Soccer League was formed in the late 1960s, okay? However, similar to the Open Cup, many of the teams chose not to compete. They considered that maybe the tournament was a waste of time, of financial travel for them, sometimes an inconvenience to their schedule. Sometimes it was the fears of possible embarrassing results. I personally don't think that would have been the case. And you just brought up the exception 1971, which was also the first time the USSF had sent two teams to the tournament, one being the Open Cup winner, which was Elizabeth Sports Club of New Jersey. They were the Open Cup champions from the previous year, 1970. And then the only NASL representative were the Rochester Lancers. They were the exception from the NASL. More specific details on the Lancers' history, on how the NASL felt of Rochester's participation, can be found in a very interesting book by a well-known soccer journalist, Michael Lewis, which is called Alive and Kicking: The Incredible But True Story of the Rochester Lancers. There is a specific chapter on the Lancers competing in the Concacaf Champions Cup. Again, I don't want to get into too much details, but it was very interesting read. But of course, I already had details on all on their respective participation at being the first NASL team competing. And they had a pretty, you could say, a decent run. They eliminated a team from, which was Pembroke Hamilton of Bermuda, and they were scheduled to play against Chivas of Guadalajara of Mexico, but goes back to what I said earlier about scheduling dates. And, it got to the point where Chivas could not play some matches in early 72, because sometimes another thing I didn't speak of is that because CONCACAF did not have any fixture international dates set, the tournament overlapped to the following year, as it did in 71, which it overlapped to March of 72, because you had to get all the teams that they needed to qualify to a final round, which took place in Guatemala, with the Lancers being one of them. And they had a decent run. They finished fourth in that respective tournament, which at the time was the highest a U.S. team had finished in the CONCACAF Champions Cup. And just to go quickly to Elizabeth Soccer Club, who only played one match against Cruz Azul, what I said earlier about sometimes some amateur teams could not have their respective players take off from work. I recently did an article on the Elizabeth Sports Club, sorry, and it was amazing how they hosted Cruz Azul in the first game, then played a scoreless draw, then they're scheduled to go play a week later, then they find out that the Mexican League has a player strike. So that affects Cruz Azul. So Cruz Azul asked CONCACAF, can they reschedule the date of the second leg? CONCACAF agreed that they could reschedule it, but Elizabeth can't make the trip because their players have already asked for time off, you see? So they had no choice but to withdraw, which was sad, but you see those kind of things happen. So that happened in that time frame. And you saw a lot of that, especially in the 70s, because many club teams that won the Champions Cup, they had their invitation, but decided, you know what, I don't have the funding, I don't have the schedule to go. Another thing would have been the players available for the trip. And it was sad that some of these teams had to pull out, as they say.
And in many of the years, based upon your research, again, the U.S. soccer did not send a representative to the tournament. But as far as performances on the field, do you think there was an improvement from the 60s to the 70s?
I would say there was some performance improvement in the early part of the 70s. Towards the later part, obviously, there were some teams that, again, an example would be a great team, that a true dynasty in the Open Cup, the Maccabees, AC, especially in your side, from Los Angeles, California. They had qualified for several CONCACAF Champions Cup, having won Open Cups, but they could not compete. So I guess their abilities were not shown on the field, and it was sad. I think there's a possibility they could have been able to display their chances, but it could have been many other factors: financial situation, player availabilities, and schedule. I saw maybe just a little bit of a decline in the 70s, because some of the teams, there were so many teams that had the opportunity to compete, but could not. It was a withdraw or forfeit leading up to the 1980s. You have to take into account that I just want to backtrack a little bit that during that time, of course, the US had several professional leagues established in its country, but they needed to send a champion to this tournament. And the only champion that they obviously crowned as a federation was the Open Cup champion. So that's why, okay, this is my Open Cup champion. This team is the one that's going to compete in the Champions Cup. There were some occasions that, very little occasions, in the 70s, example, that the Rochester Lancers from the North American Soccer League chose, hey, listen, we're the NASL champions. We want to have an opportunity to compete. And they did face a backlash. Again, I refer to what's on the book, but they chose to compete. But going into the 1980s, I was really amazed at how now some of the teams that normally you would think they would withdraw decided to, you know what, let's give it a shot. Let's play. Let's see how the results panned out. That could be a double-edged sword sometimes, but it doesn't hurt to try.
In the 1980s, there's participation mostly from the American Soccer League, later named American Professional Soccer League, as well as, again, the Cosmopolitan Soccer League. What can you say about the participation and performances in this decade?
I would say that during that era, the U.S. club's participation in the 1980s, I think they were trailblazers for the future, to what to come, because the future professional club teams that would take part. I mean, we're talking about the mid 1980s that despite the NASL ceasing operations and the U.S. missing qualification to World Cup, even the chance of hosting, because they had an opportunity to host the 86 World Cup, those 10 years, the country did receive large crowds of soccer because they hosted the 84 Olympic soccer tournament. And the U.S. won the bid to host the 94 World Cup, as well as the U.S. men's national team qualified to the 1990 World Cup. I mean, at the Champions Cup level, I did see an increase, and I saw 9 out of the 10 years, which was the first time in history of that CONCACAF tournament that you had at least one U.S. representative competing. You had teams from the league at the time, the American Soccer League champion, the Sacramento Gold, as well as continuing teams from the Open Cup, some of them coming still from the Cosmopolitan Soccer League because they were the Open Cup champions. They had their success, so going it into the international stage.
If you look at the 70s and 80s, do you think this competition was more prestigious for, let's say, Mexican clubs, or do you think they were more lukewarm to it?
You just look at the listing of champions going back to possibly the first presentation I did or the research, which was commemorating the history of the Champions Cup in 2022, it was dominated by the Mexican club teams. There were club teams from other countries or associations within CONCACAF that did get the opportunity to lift the trophy. Also, when on 2 occasions prior to 2008, two MLS teams did lift the trophy. So it pretty much comes down to is that how the teams, not so much that they take it seriously, but once they go into the tournament, how prepared are they? Because towards the later part of the 80s, going into the 90s, you're starting to get now a congested calendar of schedule of games. And then you're just seeing what is your availability, how deep your roster is. And of course, it becomes a little bit different and difficult for other teams that are not normally in a that type of a playing environment. And of course, it affected a lot of the Open Cup champions because if you look at the research, the scores were sometimes lopsided. Is it because of lack of preparation? Not really. It's just you have professional teams that play on a regular basis competing against a semi-professional and amateur team. There have been some, what you say, shockers or surprising results. Some of them coming in the 1980s. I can highlight a few very quickly. I mean, the New York Participium Freedoms in 1984 were just maybe a game or two away from reaching the final. And they had a stellar run during that tournament. but sadly they were disqualified as well as their opponent, Chivas de Guadalajara, because the two club teams, I'm just going to put it down very bluntly, they could not agree on a date to compete. Kept going back and forth, could not agree on a date. No, I can't play on this date. No, I have this date. And towards the end, regardless of who's right and who's wrong, CONCACAF had no choice but to disqualify them because the tournament had already overlapped to the following year. And they had to crown a champion, which was an Haitian club. I think it was Violette AC. So look how you get a title without playing the final, sadly. But at the time, with excluding the Rochester Rhino in 1984, was the closest a U.S. club team had gotten to possibly lifting the trophy.
The period of 1990 to 1996, it overlaps with the 1990 World Cup qualification of the United States. There's a pre-USA 94 World Cup hype as well as the tournament itself, USA 94. Did that make any difference regarding interest and performances? What was a takeaway from this period?
Well, when you reach in the 1990s, of course, the whole U.S. soccer nation was in full pre-1994 World Cup gear. And you're getting ready to stage, the biggest event in soccer history, which is the World Cup. But going at the club level, at the time, you still had, in the beginning of those early 1990s, you still had the Open Cup champion being represented in the tournament and the champions from the previous year. You still saw that the results still kept being, I wouldn't say once lopsided, but just came down to they were not as successful as the other respective clubs. An example I can give you in the early part, you had the club team from Florida, St. Petersburg, HRC Kickers, who were the Open Cup champions from the year before, qualified to the 1990 Champions Cup. Okay, after they had eliminated a fellow team that they already knew from the Open Cup final, the New York Greek America, who was obviously a club team from the Cosmopolitan League, they get paired off against Club America. Hard fought game, but experience came about and played only one game, and Club America pulled out a victory in a very grueling game that saw several players getting ejected. But what do you do in that situation? It's experience sometimes of Club America, who had already won several titles, already knew what to do in those situations. And that specific year, they went on to lift the trophy later on that year. So, the following year, you had the other Open Cup representatives still not struggling a little bit, but not being able to get the results they need. Then you go into 1992, which I think was probably the best year, I say from a professional level, because you had two key teams that had one of them playing in the American Professional Soccer League, which was the San Francisco Bay Blackhawks. And then you had the Dallas Rockets, who were also Open Cup runners-up from the year before, but had played or they were the champions in the Sun Belt Independent Soccer League, which is now known as the United Soccer League. So you had two teams now with a professional background going into this tournament, and what I saw from this result and this history, they went on and they had pretty much an historic run. Both teams had eliminated three different club teams to reach their respective rounds. Sadly, I wouldn't say at the same time, but the Dallas Rockets were eliminated by once again Club America from Mexico in their two-game series, and then Club America went on to play San Francisco, and in a series that was split in two, each one winning in their home field, but one goal, the aggregate goal, decided that San Francisco could not reach the final. So there was improvement. Maybe it was the excitement of the World Cup just around the corner, but it was something that many fans were looking forward to seeing. And then maybe it was too much excitement for the 94 tournament because even though you had another professional soccer league team, the Los Angeles Salsa, almost close to your neck of the state, competing in the Champions Cup, but two games and they're out. After the World Cup, maybe people were still soaking in what had happened. And of course, you had MLS just maybe a year away. But sadly, there wasn't a U.S. representative in the 94 Champions Cup, which would be the last time a U.S. team would miss the tournament. Because since then, every other year, there would be a representative from the US. And for the 96 edition, a familiar team, but they were not under the banner of the North American Soccer League, the Seattle Sounders, who had reemerged, but they were playing in the inaugural A League, which eventually, somehow connected with the United Soccer League, and a tournament that, again, overlapped to the following year because of scheduling conflicts. The calendar was starting to be fully congested, let's say, for some, either not just for national teams, but also for club teams. They could not advance or reach the finals of their tournament. They did reach the final round group, but could not. Their results, don't want to embarrass them, but I mean, you would have to look at, it doesn't take a genius, just look up the 96, 97 tournament and you can see what were the results that they had. But the Seattle Sounders were like the last team. They were not an MLS team at the time to compete. And afterwards, then in 97, the MLS teams started to participate in the Champions Cup.
Your research ends in 96 when MLS starts, and that's a whole different era, of course. Do you plan on doing a similar research for this era?
Yes, I do. Because there was a period, obviously, from 97 to 2008 where two MLS teams did lift the Champions Cup. And of course, the research would probably be a little bit easier to track down because of the years. But yes, that would be in the long run. Just going back to this completed project is, yes, anybody that looks through the document is very detailed. Each respective year, each respective team competing. I would love to put the finishing touches or the icing on the cake, being able to get all the match reports and all the goal scorers from each of the U.S., at least the games that were played. Not the ones, obviously, that the team withdrew or forfeit. No, that's already in the book, but so-and-so team, here are the goal scorers, here's the lineup, etc. And I'm happy to say that I do have 90% of it complete, but there's still some little missing games here and there, details here that I would love to reach out or if any of the historians from some of the club teams that have competed in this tournament that are still around may have those details, it'd be welcome to add to make it a final piece to the puzzle.
Due to the establishment of the MLS, American clubs perhaps would have taken this competition more seriously.
Like I said, some clubs, when I did this research, you can tell right off the bat, and this is just my opinion. I mean, anybody that can read the document can pretty much say, even you looking at it or anybody else, that when a club team, you can see it, you can tell that the club team took it seriously because of the way the results came about, each of them. They wanted to go as far as they could. I just highlighted some of the teams that I thought were successful in their run. And I gave you some years that how some of these teams, I think, took the tournament seriously. There could have been situations where some factors were made that the club team had situations that they had to resolve. I'm not going to mention this club team, but this club team was in a league. They could not compete. They were scheduled to compete against an opponent. They could not compete because the club team sadly ceased operations. Now, I'll let anybody that wants to look through the book that can figure out who it is. I don't want to, embarrass the club name or what have you, but, it did occur. And that's sad because those are things that are out of the club's competition's control because there's nothing you can do if the club's ceased operations. So that means the club team can't compete. So, but do you think that they didn't take the tournament seriously? I don't think that would be the case. If my opinion is that if you withdrew from the tournament, you had your reasons. It wasn't because you didn't take the tournament seriously. Either you had the financial situation that you could not make the trip. Could have been schedule conflicts with your respective league. I already mentioned one occasion, sometimes the players who had full-time jobs or their jobs separately could not take time off. Does that categorize them as not taking the tournament seriously? In my opinion, I don't think so. There were reasons that they withdraw. I think if you had the opportunity to compete, you take the best opportunity you can. I'm sure that's what the MLS teams are doing now with the tournament. They take the tournament seriously because since a certain amount of year, I think since 2005, it was an automatic qualifier to, at the time, the Club World Cup, if I'm not mistaken. So that's an added bonus to wanting to win the tournament. Why do you think so many, quote unquote, the Mexican teams have dominated the tournament? Because they want to be at the center stage at the world event. Because they know that you're going to go and compete at the Club World Cup. You see what I mean? Or whatever it's called. I know it's changed its name, but you have that opportunity. It's obvious that now that if you withdraw, you're going to get fined by CONCACAF
Right.
or you get penalized for it. Now, whether or not these club teams got penalized, that's more of a research. But it was just interesting. There were reasons why the club team could not compete. Back then, it's great that you have the opportunity, but you're able to make the trip. Sometimes there are things that are out of your control. Maybe I would say going through this document, Sean, is that maybe one or two, I think, didn't really take the tournament seriously. It's obvious if you look at the document, but I would say the majority of ones, even the ones that qualified and didn't play a game, I think, to my opinion, took the tournament seriously. And as I said earlier, they were front runners and pioneers to what now you see the club teams competing in the tournament, which are more MLS teams.
So, in closing, just looking at this period from 1963 to 1996, what is the historical legacy of this tournament for American soccer in a period that encompassed disinterest regarding the game here, as well as the hype of the North American Soccer League era?
Well, I think this may have been mentioned by others on many of occasions. Maybe it's just a bold statement that there was U.S. club soccer at the international level before 1994 and even before the formation of MLS. I guess the whole purpose of something that I began with just a presentation, as I said earlier, to Sash at the time, then realizing that, you know what, let's complete the research. Let's find out why these club teams competed, had the opportunity, and then so there was action. There was some sort of history prior to a certain year. So, I mean, I know this may have been said on many times that, hey, before the World Cup of 94, hey, soccer was around. Even before the start of the North American Soccer League and Pele with the New York Cosmos. Prior to that, there was soccer. Not as popular as it was beforehand, but there were trailblazers. I think all these teams that you see in this document, in this presentation, were pioneers and front runners because, you could say, okay, who was the first team that competed from Chicago? Chicago Creation. You see what I mean? A lot of people would say, oh, it's the Chicago Fire. Oh, no. It's the Chicago Creation. Who was the first New York team? Was the New York Hungaria. No, it's not. It wasn't the Red Bulls. It wasn't, New York FC. You see what I mean? So it's good to have that as a basis because it's part of history and it leads to what you have in the future. Hopefully, this will be a well taken document. And I also hope that I'm open to any additional information that can be provided because the more accurate it is, the better it is for the reader.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information are listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Stephen, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for having me. It's been a great honor and pleasure to be once again on your show. So.